Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Nurse Scientist Translational Research Interest Group. This is Elizabeth Cohen, and on behalf of myself, David Banks, and Rachel Schiffman, we welcome you to this call. And we are going to get started in just a few minutes with our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Corella from the CTSA Clinical Innovations and Clinical Translational Science Awards. He leads the Division of Clinical Innovation for the CTSA programs. I have heard him speak before. I have spoken with him before, and it will be a wonderful presentation. So we'll give people just a few minutes to get settled and sign on. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I can see people logging in, but I'll just see them one at a time. So I'm going to give people just one more minute, and then we'll welcome them again. I'm going to ask you to log your attendance in on the doodle poll, and we welcome you to this first call of our spring semester, of our all-weather semester here in New York. So hang on. Okay, I'm just going to wait till the fire trucks and ambulances go by my office. That's New York. So we warmly welcome you to this February call for the Nurse Scientist Translational Research Interest Group. I'm Elizabeth Cohen, and on behalf of myself and Rachel Schiffman, my co-chair, and David Banks, our NINR liaison, we welcome you to this very exciting call, and we welcome Dr. Michael Corella, who leads the Division of Clinical Innovation for the Clinical and Translational Science Award programs at NCATS. And that office supports innovative solutions to advance the efficiency, quality, and the impact of translational science with the ultimate goal, which we share with him, of getting more treatments to more patients more quickly. It's the largest NIH initiative, and it supports the national network of medical research institutions that work together to tackle system-wide scientific and operational problems in clinical and translational research that no one team could overcome by itself. Dr. Corella's bio appears in the announcement for this call, but he has had an amazing career spanning biodefense, translational research, and various positions at NIH as well as the World Health Organization. He holds a PhD in microbiology and immunology as well as an MD from Duke University, and was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard and did residency in pathology at Brigham and Women's. So we are really pleased. I want to confess that this was one of the best pre-webinar calls I've ever had with anyone. So thank you for that opportunity, and I have seen Dr. Corella speak in the past, and I know that you will get much enjoyment out of this. And to Dr. Banks's point, we are being recorded. So Dr. Corella, we can play that, save it, and play it for your wife or others later on. So I'm going to advance the slides for you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. We go on to the next slide. So Elizabeth basically described the general overall structure of the CTSA program, Clinical and Translational Science Awards. We just generally call it CTSA. But let me give you a little bit of background and history. So this program actually predates the center at NIH that it is located in, which is NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, because it was originally created in 2006, or it was stood up in 2006, and it was part of, at that time, Elias Zerhouni, who was the director of NIH. He had instituted a large-scale program referred to as the Roadmap, which was really trying to identify aspects of the biomedical enterprise that fell between the cracks of what NIH typically did. And this fell out of one particular category, which was reinventing the clinical enterprise. And it came about because there was a perception that the clinical research activities that NIH was supporting were being very poorly supported overall, and the training was really lacking. Picked it up, and unfortunately the people who were getting the most amount of experience were those who were doing work for the pharmaceutical industry. And so coupled with some other evolving situations, which was a greater desire for multi-center research involving more than one clinical site, as well as a recognition that there needed to be more community engagement in terms of defining and participating in clinical research. The CTSA program really grew out of what had previously been known as the GCRCs, or the General Clinical Research Centers, which were largely just focused on very specific clinical activities and very limited in what they could do. And the CTSAs introduced a community component, the multi-center component, and the clinical training component. And it was seen as not simply just something for the academic MDs, but really to talk about really reinventing the entire clinical experience, including pharmacy, schools of public health, and some of the more diverse fields such as engineering and obviously nursing as well. So it has been around now for going on its 13th year. NCATS was created in 2012, where the CTSA program was moved out of its original home, which was in the National Center for Research Resources, and then combined with a number of other trans-NIH programs to really have a focus specifically on translation rather than a specific disease. So if we go on to the next slide, that gives you a sort of gives you the overview of our goals. As I mentioned, train and cultivate the translational science workforce. This was seen as something that really needed to get a little more attention and focus. And then, as I mentioned, with community engagement, engage the patients and communities in every phase. Don't come to them at the end or when you're ready to begin a clinical trial, begin enrolling, but come to them even when you're thinking about establishing a clinical trial. It was also seen as a focus for promoting the integration of special and underserved populations. And then in general, no single institute at NIH, if you talk about, for example, NCI, the National Cancer Institute, NHLBI, Heart, Lung, and Blood, NIDDK, Digestive Diseases and Kidney, none of them are really focused on the quality and efficiency of the process of translational research. They're focused on their specific conditions. And that focus on the process itself was given to the CTSA program. And then finally, and I'll give you some examples of this, really this was in its infancy at the time, but a recognition that informatics was going to be playing a much, much more major role in medical care overall and medical research. So on the next slide, it gives you a of what the CTSA encompasses. So we have over 50 currently. At the moment, we have 58 what we define as hubs. It's a center award to the institution, and it includes with it a career development program, which we refer to as a KL2. That's for that training component. And then it has an optional, although as you can see, the majority of the hubs, in fact, include that, which is an institutional training program, so a little bit earlier than the career development. In terms of the KL2 programs, each hub has one. At any given time, we're supporting a little over 325 positions. I'll show you some examples of what the kinds of things these individuals do. And then for the training programs, it's a little more diverse. It can be pre-docs, it can be post-docs. We've seen some sort of short-term where it may be a year out from medical school or nursing school, in that matter, for those individuals to undertake a research project. Some institutions have come up with some novel summer programs for undergraduates, particularly trying to draw on minority populations from institutions that typically don't get involved in research. So they've used it in a number of innovative ways. On the next slide gives you a high-level overview of our program activities. You can advance one slide, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I don't know. I have lost my ability to advance. My apologies. I'm going to try to see if I can. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Maybe when
there we go. That's it. Okay.
Yep. Okay.
So related to the CTSAs, we have a number of programs that span beyond just individual hubs. The Trial Innovation Network, which is really focused on innovating the process of conducting clinical trials, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We have instituted trying to speed up this process, Smart IRB, and I'll discuss that a little bit. Oddly enough, it may seem kind of counterintuitive, but finding patients with a particular condition to study is not always a trivial task. And accrual to clinical trials, the ACT, is a process of trying to use electronic means for cohort discovery to identify where the patients are that you're really trying to study. As I mentioned earlier, the focus on biomedical informatics, we have a whole program that we refer to as CD2H, Clinical Data to Health, and it is a collection of various informatics individuals across the country who both have their own projects through this, but they also poll the community trying to identify what are some of the informatics challenges that they can really address. And then lastly, as a way of trying to encourage collaboration across the CTSA program, which has always been an issue for institutions, we have programs that specifically require multiple CTSAs to come together to work on joint projects, and I'll give you some examples of those. So on the next slide, the Trial Innovation Network is composed of it has three components. We have 3 Trial Innovation Centers, and then we have a Recruitment Innovation Center, and then we have all of our CTSA program hubs. And what they're really focused on is trying to really innovate the process and conduct of clinical trials, both from a logistical or administrative standpoint as well as from a scientific standpoint. So novel trial designs, bringing forward new statistical approaches, looking at innovative endpoints, but also looking at the nuts and bolts. And you'll see that the Smart IRB is one of these, that I'll talk to in a minute, is one of these approaches. But it's really, it's there for the community at large to use and not restricted to the CTSAs. We are supporting, at any given time, dozens and dozens of clinical trials that are being funded by other NIH ICs that have come to the TIN for support in various aspects. One of the most recent ones, which you'll see on the next slide, is the utilization of single IRB. So on the next slide, Smart IRB is a means of simplifying the way multi-site trials can be conducted. We have over 500 participating institutions across the country. Whenever you want to do a multi-site trial and you're going to institute a single IRB, there has to be agreements in place as to which IRB is the reviewing and which IRBs are relying. And there's a lot of legal ramifications here. It is not uncommon for this type of negotiations, particularly for large multi-center trials, to take upwards of 8 to 10 months to conclude before there's agreement to begin now talking about so on the next slide, it just provides a broad overview. This is a large-scale treaty that is sign once and implement. So those 500 institutions I mentioned, their general counsels at those institutions have all signed on to this. So it's done once, and every time a new study is wanting to be contemplated, there is no need to renegotiate this. The agreement is already in place. The decisions are just made as to who is relying, who is reviewing, and it goes forward.
So she might encounter.
We've set up quite a bit of informatics support. So there's a lot of online capabilities, and we also basically helping people do this. The reason this is so critical now is because it is currently NIH policy that multi-center trials funded by NIH must utilize a single IRB. So in the past, it was possible to ignore this and just go the old-fashioned way, and it might take longer, but it was straightforward. Now, single IRB is the operating principle by which we have to do this. So on the next slide is just giving you an example of how we're utilizing the Trial Innovation Network. The HEAL initiative, which is the opioid, what NIH is doing with all the opioid money that we've received, we put forth a proposal to, since a major component of HEAL is looking at alternative interventions and approaches to deal with pain management. There are a lot of alternatives to opioids out there, but the medical evidence for them is a little bit limiting, and it makes it difficult in terms of integrating this into clinical guidelines by professional societies. So we have established the Pain Effectiveness Research Network, and currently there's a FOA out on the street, a funding opportunity announcement, dealing with looking at effectiveness studies addressing pain management for any and all conditions. This will be run through the Trial Innovations Network, so any investigator anywhere can propose to this, and depending on what the specific pain condition is, they will be funded through their individual IC where that condition is most relevant. But the operation and management of the clinical trial will be handled by the Trial Innovation Network, and will be providing support such as biostatistics, recruitment, and master contracts, and providing central IRBs for all of these services. This is something that is still that funding announcement is still on the street, so we don't know what we're going to get in yet, but we will know next week, I think, when the receipt date comes in. So on the next slide, as I mentioned, cohort discovery is not exactly a trivial thing, and so the software to do this is what the ACT is developing, so that rather than having to go query individual electronic medical records or individual institutions as to identifying patients, a single query can be put out and automatically get answered and fed back. And this is making it easier to decide where clinical trial sites should be located and where most of the important where the patient numbers are needed and actually to enable a trial. It also very quickly allows establishment of feasibility. Are there enough patients out there with the specific inclusion-exclusion criteria that are being established for the protocol to actually conduct a trial of this type? So it is becoming very, very important, and there's a lot of other players trying to do this, but this is our foray into this area. On the next slide, to talk a little bit about informatics. Now, this has come a very long way for those of you, and there probably aren't many of you who have been around as long as I have. You know, with the old way we've done it is a lot of siloed data, very static methodologies, and very homegrown type of software tools that people have used. What we're really moving to, and policies are moving in this regard as well, is data sharing, other ways of accumulating data and distributing data, and particularly through cloud computing, as you'll see in a minute what we're really trying to do with this, to really move it to the forefront so that it's not holding people back. On the next slide, gives you some examples. If you look down the left-hand side, this is traditionally what we've had in terms of very discrete and limited clinical data that people could really, hold in their head or put down on a notebook. When you start to look on the right-hand side, the kinds of high-throughput data we're getting, and when you try to start encompassing these vastly different ways of accumulating data from exercise, wearables, microbiome, diet, genomic type things, this is really creating forcing a whole new way of really looking at how we accumulate, how we acquire the data, how we store the data, and how we utilize the data. And so the CD2H is really looking at a wealth of projects that are really spanning this space, trying to address and create tools that the healthcare sector will be able to utilize to be able to deal with what is really becoming just a data deluge. On the next slide, just wanted to give one example. So our evolving cyber landscape, so if you do one more click there, this is what it looks like now. We have an academic sprawl. Everyone has their own little data sets. What we're looking for is the future, what we call the NCATS park, and that is much higher density, but rather than having each institution establish their own data place, we want to have a cloud-based capacity that we can buy, and to a certain extent, I can buy it wholesale relative to institutions that are buying it retail. So it offers us a lot of unique opportunities in terms of collaborative space that we can make available, which we're deploying with tools like Google Suites and those sorts of things that are just freely available to the academic community that participates in the with a federated logon through the CTSA program. And the other aspect here that I think is very important to recognize is that the evolving cybersecurity issues that institutions have to deal with are really becoming rather overwhelming. And at the national level, and this is not something unique to NCATS, but the USG itself, the entire federal government, is moving into the cloud. And so it offloads a lot of those security requirements, those onerous security requirements that are really driving a lot of costs at academic institutions. So this is in the process of being stood up right now. We're beginning to play with this, and we're beginning to populate it, and you'll see this is the move that will be occurring over the next several years. On the next slide, I wanted to give you one example of some of the types of projects that are going on. So this came out of the Harvard CTSA. They created a research networking software which really provides a very comprehensive amount of information of individual researchers at academic institutions. So Harvard developed this, but then as you'll see on the next slide, they basically made it open source, and they just allowed anyone to put it on and adopt it for their own use. And multiple CTSAs are using this, but even programs that are not directly affiliated with CTSAs have been able to adopt this. So this is available to the academic community. Makes it much easier to identify potential collaborators and find individuals of like interest or particular skill sets that would be valuable to any individual investigator. On the next slide, so we want to enhance the ability for collaborations, and you really have to, quite frankly, you have to dangle funding in front of investigators in order to promote collaborations. And so by forcing multiple CTSAs to come together on a joint project, this is how we've been able to enable collaborations that really can drive innovation, where unique capabilities or resources or skill sets of multiple institutions can be brought together to really do something that no single institution can do. So if you go on to the next slide, I have one example. I have a couple of examples of these. This is a very interesting one. This is called Early Check. Now, there are 3 CTSAs in North Carolina at UNC, Duke, and Wake Forest, and they partnered along with the North Carolina State Department of Health for this program. Now, this is about 2 years old, but it actually went live. If you live in North Carolina, you can probably find it. It went live last fall, and what it does is, so many people are probably familiar with the recommended uniform screening panel, which is diseases we screen newborn infants for. Now, historically, the way what we've screened for are things that we can treat. Phenylketonuria is a sort of classic example. If you find that, you put the child on a low phenylalanine diet, and you prevent a lot of the subsequent mental impairment that occurs. But the feeling was that if there was nothing to treat the child with, what was the point of screening the child at birth? Well, the reality is, if you think at some point you may actually have an intervention and you'd like to get that intervention into the child as young as possible, if you can't screen for it, you won't be able to actually demonstrate the utility of the intervention. So this early check is a program to actually see if parents would be willing to have their newborns, that nothing additional is done. It's just that sample of blood that is used for the regular screening is also utilized to test for additional things. And so far it's been very positive. The two use cases that they're using at this point is Fragile X and spinal muscular atrophy. And there is some promise that there may actually be potential interventions for these two conditions in the near future. And so the ability to screen for them will make it much easier to actually demonstrate the efficacy of those potential interventions. On the next slide is another joint project among 4 CTSAs, Ohio State, Michigan, Tufts, and Rochester. And I'm not a big fan in terms of the acronym, but it seems to be people put a lot of effort in trying to come up with acronyms. So this is DIAMOND. You can see it's a little tortured in how they came about of that. But this is a discovery learning space for clinical research professionals. The idea here is that lots of different competencies in many different aspects of the healthcare center can be for training purposes and assessments. People can provide on this space website their competencies, so it in the future may become something where it's a go-to site for actually identifying potential candidates. And the idea here is to get broad agreement on what really defines the competency for lots of different types of aspects of clinical research professionals across the healthcare spectrum. On the next slide, I wanted to just point out this is an article from just a little over a year ago, curriculum development that appeared in the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science. Barry Collar, who is the CTSA PI from Rockefeller, and along with several individuals affiliated with nursing schools, has put out this article that all nurses need to be research nurses, that training needs to include the ability not just to really beyond just simply nursing, but to also be involved as nursing component of research activities. And I put the DOI thing there for a subsequent if people want to pull that article down. On the next slide, wanted to give you some idea of some of the projects that we support. All of the CTSA hubs have what we call pilot projects, which are small funding but high risk, high reward type. And this is one that was particularly captivating from the University of California, San Diego. And it's basically, it seems kind of trivial, but it's stretchable electronics. And so they refer to it as smart bandage. It actually did make the cover of Nature Electronics, and Francis Collins, the director of NIH, tweeted this out because he thought it was kind of nifty. The idea here behind it is simply that there's a lot of physiological signals and measurements that would be desirable and a lot of applications. But if you have a stiff electronic, it's not going to work in a sort of gooey type of biological setting that the human body is. The interesting thing is, from our perspective, is the way this came about was the CTSA program at UCSD sponsors I think it occurs about once a month, which brings together investigators from the School of Engineering with clinicians. The clinicians describe clinical issues or problems they're dealing with that is limiting what they can do. And then the engineers put their heads together and actually come up with, well, is this going to work? Is this going to work? Is this going to work? And that's where this came out of. So it's bringing together that multidisciplinary component where a lot of the real innovative solutions come from, and this is a real hallmark of what the CTSAs are able to do. On the next slide is another pilot project that I'm particularly fascinated by. So Steve Moulton, who is a pediatric trauma surgeon, developed this, but it has a very interesting background when you get into the idea of multidisciplinary. So this project actually, long before Steve was involved, began as a NASA program to look at human responses to acceleration, something that Air Force fighter pilots and astronauts have to undergo. So they created a chamber that was able to create a lower body negative pressure, basically sucking blood from your head down into the lower part of your body. And that was done for NASA, had their reasons for doing that. Someone from the Department of Defense got wind of this and got the idea that this might simulate hemorrhage. And so it was set up at a Department of Defense facility that was looking at monitoring for hemorrhage, because unfortunately a lot of the other parameters in terms of measuring the when a patient is near collapse, when the blood loss is significant, does not do very good. Blood pressure, heart rate, cardiac output, those types of things. So they were collecting a lot of data, and then Steve got the idea that this might be something that could be really simplified. So with a pilot project, he was able to have a graduate student utilize a software that falls under the category of feature extraction that had been developed by a DARPA NSF program. And what they came up with is this little device. It basically looks like a pulse oximeter that you can see the finger wearing it. And you put this on your finger, and it continuously measures beat-to-beat changes in their arterial pulse waveform. And so when I was out in Colorado visiting this, he put it on me, and I'm sitting there, and it's measuring about 0.94. And he said, typically you're around 1. And I said, why am I low? And he said, well, we're a mile above sea level, so you're a little O2 deficient at this point. But he said, now stand up. And when I stood up, it dropped to about 0.7, and then it slowly came back up. And he said, if it drops down to 0.3 or lower, you're going to pass out. And that's what it is actually used for now. So they were able to use the Department of Defense data to actually justify doing a clinical trial, which they did in an emergency room, and the device was cleared by the FDA just about two years ago, and is being used in hospitals now. They refer to it as a compensatory reserve index, and it's a better predictor of when a patient is going to pass out from hemorrhage, so you can better manage that patient moving forward. It's a pretty neat. On the next slide, just wanted to highlight some of the things we did last year with regard to the opioid crisis. These are a number of supplements that we provided in response to the CTSAs coming forth with ideas that they could utilize for addressing some of the multiple issues across the nation in the opioid crisis. And you'll see that there's a lot of diversity here, from pharmacy-based interventions, machine learning from a lot of databases that have been around for a long, long time, and patient registries for burn and trauma. So still a lot of activities going on with regard to opioids. On the next slide, I wanted to give you just one example of the types of community engagement. This was one that Harvard actually sponsored almost 2 years ago. The Beacon is a publication of the Scleroderma Foundation of New England. And what they did was, in collaboration with the MIT Small Devices Lab, they brought in several dozen scleroderma patients and spoke with them about what do they problematic in terms of their functioning. From as simple as, in some cases, it's the disease prevents them from actually using the touch screen on a smartphone. And so with these engineers who are used to working with small devices, they were on demand making little things for these people. And then, interestingly, some of those, the patients, the scleroderma individuals took home. They played with them. They provided some feedback. And so there's a whole host of little devices of all types that are in development in terms of commercializing because of the results of this type of engagement. On the next slide, wanted to highlight some of the scholars, and this one I found particularly fascinating because it involves drones. I think so for anyone with teenagers who are constantly playing video games, and you're thinking that the only thing your child is going to be able to do is to work for the Department of Defense shooting Hellfire missiles or something like that. Jessica here is with the North Carolina CTSA, and she is working on a feasibility study for delivery of AED basically defibrillators by drones. So for rural settings and other remote settings, the drone may actually be the fastest way to get that. Not every in a low population density, you may not have these defibrillators in easy access as we do in many large buildings around here. So the possibility that we can actually move these very quickly with drones is quite appealing, and I think it's one of those fascinating types of innovations that can really make a big difference in under certain conditions. On the next slide is another very interesting one. Rebecca here, she actually was a TL1 scholar at one CTSA and has now moved on to become a KL2 scholar at another CTSA. And she's really combining a number of things on the informatics side, specifically looking at trying to machine learning to try to detect sepsis earlier. She has a very varied background, having been with the U.S. Army and done a lot in terms of health information technology. So she's perfectly suited to really focus on the kind of data science aspects and really apply it beyond just what she was doing for the Army. On the next slide is one of our TL1 scholars, and Kia is from the UCLA program, and she's focused on looking at racial and ethnic minority groups, and specifically healthcare disparities, and looking specifically at behavioral and psychological impacts on type 2 diabetes among African Americans. We're seeing a lot of these types of focuses, and it is where we see a lot of impactful work being done. On the next slide, I just want to finish with a line from Florence Nightingale that I think we do continually need to make progress and push the boundaries of what we're doing. And the innovation that we are seeing within the CTSA program really comes from the interface of the various disciplines, whether it's School of Medicine and School of Nursing working together, engineering and pharmacy working together. It's really where the new ideas are coming from, and the really impactful results of what we do are really being felt. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
We thank you so much for this and for exposing us to so much of, things that we knew and then things that are brand new, I'm sure, to some people on the call. I'd like to open it up for questions. David, I don't know, I'm still sharing my screen, so I think you can unmute people and we'll take some questions for Dr. Corella. This was ever fabulous, so thank you so much. Are there questions from people on the line? It looks like somebody is trying to speak. And also I want to say that the group can sometimes be quiet, but I know that they'll have questions for you from today. I'm going to give people just another minute to make sure they've unmuted themselves.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi, this is Wendy Miller from Indiana University School of Nursing, and I agree that was an excellent presentation. I just have a little bit more, I would like to know a little bit more about the drone study. I think that is just so incredibly innovative and interesting. In terms of when you talked about delivering the AEDs by, that sounds like such a great idea. How did that even get started? If someone wants to do something like that, I wouldn't even know who to learn. I need to learn how to do this intervention that's drone based.
Yeah. So so this is her KL2 Scholar project. So KL2 scholars are usually junior faculty, and they will get funding typically for, at most places, 2, sometimes 3 years. And the idea behind the KL2 is that that KL2 award covers 75% of their salary, which gives them 75% protected time for research activities. So, and then they have to have a research proposal, because this is what is being paid for. And I know that, so she is a KL2 scholar from last year, so she's just begun this work. I think the numbers we looked at, probably over the entire lifetime of the KL2 program, we probably had about 1,800, I think the number is somewhere around 1,800 KL2 scholars, and I looked this up. 99 of them actually came from nursing schools. So I think there are 15 currently right now who were new ones who were from 18. And the drone study just really fascinated me. She has an article. I don't know if I have the citation for it, but if you search on her name, you might be able to find it. She has an article where they discuss this feasibility, or the potential for this, and I think there are clearly barriers that they have identified to defibrillators in communities where this happens, because 80% of sudden cardiac arrests occur out of hospitals, and you can call 911 and an ambulance can be deployed, but the reality is the drones can really go as the crow flies, and can probably be directed there faster, so that it can actually be there even before the ambulance arrives, and that may make all the difference in the world. We know, for example, that there's a prior program at the University of Colorado that was looking at trying to increase just CPR in out-of-hospital sudden cardiac arrest training, and finding out that certain communities were less likely to do that, and to find culturally specific ways of training people and informing people of how to do that. So I think this is an area, particularly in the rural communities, where it may take a while for the ambulance to get there. The drone has the ability probably to get there faster. And we can talk about getting your delivery by Amazon by drone, but this is truly the potential for a life-saving intervention.
Yeah, I think it's fabulous, especially for the rural communities. And I did find the article just that I was searching as you were talking,
yes.
so I'm going to pass that on to the other faculty in my school. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. I also want to say early on in the call, the idea of the screening for newborns for the Fragile X and for other diseases, can also help us with identifying where those people may be, as we advance some of the cures. So I think some of the stuff is just really cool. Some of it is great ideas. Some of it is good common sense and thinking ahead. I mean, this presentation contained so much. Are there other questions? I'm going to give people another minute because sometimes it's a process of getting yourself off mute and the computer off mute.
Okay.
Hi,
Jay,
this
do you
is
have
Mary from.
Go ahead.
Sorry, a great presentation. Thank you. I'm actually driving on the car listening and wondering if you had mentioned if you're going to be able to share your slides.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing.
Yeah. She asked, I can share the slides, and this will be archived we'll put it up on the website. So, but yes, I'll share the slides. Please do not reply to the email that is sent out as an invitation. Please reply only to Elizabeth Cohen, just as a single, start a new email, and I will send the slides to anyone who did not receive them.
Thank you.
One last question for Dr. Corella, if there are. Do you have any questions for us?
Well, no. The only other thing I wanted to comment on is that, as I mentioned, we are moving towards this cloud-enabled platform, and at least as I was informed, this organization did come out of one of the original CTSAs, what they called KFCs. I apologize. We never seem to do a very good job of coming up with acronyms. maybe the fact that many people do spend a lot of time doing it is worth it, but we never come up with good acronyms. But what we are hoping to be able to create is the opportunity for homes for these, and again, we were going to say special interest groups, but that sounds a little pejorative, at least here in Washington, so we're avoiding that. But the idea of having the opportunity for providing space in the cloud for discussion forums where people can create the kind of topics, around the kind of topics that self-aggregate, a home for people with some functionality of Google Suites capabilities to put files and scheduling and those sorts of things up there. So topics as broad as nursing, but as specific as using drones to do something in healthcare. I think drones in healthcare could be a whole discussion forum that like-minded people who are playing with drones can really get together online and really engage in the process of learning from each other. So that we see as becoming a much more feasible and tractable and viable approach to how a lot of these interdisciplinary type concepts can really find enough fertilizer.
That's great. Rachel, do you have anything that you want to add to this?
No, I'm fine. Thank you. It was very good. I really enjoyed it.
It was so excellent. I can't even begin to thank you. And I don't know if anyone else has one last question. Otherwise, we'll take just a few minutes for announcements from our group. We thank you again, Dr. Carrillo. I really learn something every single time we speak, or 3 things every single time we speak. So I look forward to the next time that we do, and we appreciate this presentation, and it is recorded and archived, and I will send the slides around, and I think it will generate a tremendous amount not only of partnership, but of new and innovative ideas. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.